everybody. I'm Tom. I'm a first-year doctoral student at Oxford. I'm sorry I couldn't make it to the previous conference. I was about 3 months old. But I'm very happy to be here now, being part of the younger cohort, giving our views today. So I'm primarily a linguist, actually, but I was reading Menander's Samia, and it really struck me how, when I was reading the play, reading the commentaries, reading some of the literature, that everybody assumes that the sexual encounter between Moschion and Plangon in the play is an instance of rape. And the text didn't seem to read that way to me. So I thought this is quite an interesting question. How do we sort of decide? How can we tell? What assumptions do we make? What questions are we asking in that kind of question? So in this talk, I'm just going to give what I think of as the case for seeing the rape, or rather the encounter, as consensual. Because I'm talking basically about whether it's consensual or non-consensual in terms of modern understanding of rape. In some respects, furthering arguments made by Karen Pierce in the previous volume. So, as I say, most scholars tend to assume that the sexual encounter is one of rape. But if we look for arguments, we find them under item 1 on the handout. The two main arguments for rape here is that there is no clear case in New Comedy of the consensual seduction of a woman known to be of citizen status. Such a woman would have shown herself to be of bad character, unfit to be the wife or mother of a citizen, and unfit to participate in civic religion. Okay? And the second argument is that the various references in the text all treat Plangon as purely a victim and not as a consenting participant. That's item 1 on your handout. So I'll be basically addressing these 2 points in turn and trying to make some interesting comments along the way. But I thought it might be beneficial first to give you the sort of, at the beginning of the play, the description of what happened by Moschion. The play sort of, it's in bits, right, but it starts being understandable from about here. And I won't read it out, but sort of toward the end there, he says, well, he's been out and about, he comes home, and he finds that the festival of the Adonia is happening at his house. Tries to go to bed, it's too noisy, he can't go to bed, walks downstairs, as he puts it, becomes a spectator. And in the end, what he says is, to say what happened next, I am ashamed perhaps when there's no need, but still I am ashamed. The girl got pregnant, saying that I say what happened earlier too. So he very sort of coyly, if you will, he says, he doesn't describe the nature of the encounter at all. He just says she got pregnant, and everyone knows what that means. There was an encounter there. And so that's pretty ambiguous. Unlike, if you turn over on page 2, the encounter is described in Menander's Epitropontes, where it seems pretty clear from the 2 references that the sex was non-consensual. So Pamphlet is described as she's sort of tearing her hair and sobbing, her clothes are all torn and destroyed, and another character in a sort of rather cruel, mocking speech, pretending to be Pamphlet, says, "How roughly you forced me down, oh dear, the dress I spoiled." So clearly, New Comedy does involve rape, as we would describe it, but as I say, I want to talk about this more ambiguous case. So if we turn to the first argument that we saw at the beginning, the one about there's no other instance of a woman being seduced, this basically comes from the law of moikeia, as we have it in our legal texts. And I think one thing that's, one of many things that's become more well understood since the previous conference is sort of understanding of moikeia. It's not just adultery, it's sex which goes against the permission of the woman's kurios. So in the case where the woman's husband is involved, as it were, we would call that adultery. But in the case where the woman is unmarried and it's her father whose consent has been violated, we would call that pre-marital sex. So that allows us to distinguish between adultery moikeia and pre-marital moikeia, and I'll be referring to these in what follows. So I've given you the text of the sort of description of the law as we have it. I won't read it out, but it's basically, as I sort of summarised earlier, that a woman who's been sort of caught with a moikos, so either an adulterer or a seducer, depending on the context, she should be kept away from civic religion, blah, 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 so that our sanctuaries may be kept free from all pollution and profanation, and that our women may be inspired with a fear sufficient to make them live soberly and avoid all vice, etc., etc. Now, I suppose the sort of argument I'd like to set forth is that this law appears, while technically to be applicable to anyone who's guilty of moikeia, the language involved suggests that it was in practice only really applied to those who are guilty of adultery moikeia. I think this for a few reasons. So the language that Apollodorus uses talks about the woman being thrown out of the husband's home. to andros in the common sense of aner as a husband. I'm unfamiliar with any sense of aner as a father as well. And it's interesting that in the Samia, I don't want to spend too much time going through it, but basically Moschion's father, Demias, thinks that his son has had sex with his pseudo-wife, Palike figure, and he throws her out of the house. So he appears to sort of be going through this process where he starts to be punishing her for adultery moikeia. The second point is that all the cases we know about adultery moikeia, and that's probably because women, given that they got married so young, there wasn't much time for premarital moikeia to actually occur, because as soon as you hit sort of sexual maturity or even earlier, you're married off, and suddenly any kind of moikeia is then adultery moikeia. And the nomos moikeios which follows, which is an insertion, I think clearly, I haven't given it to you, I think it clearly refers to a man and a wife. It clearly talks about two people in an oikos, in a sort of marital relationship. And this was either based on an original, or the person who inserted it saw the nomos moikeios really only applying to adultery. Furthermore, at the beginning of page 3, we have two references showing how a father might punish his daughter if he'd found that she had had premarital sex, and neither of them actually correspond to the law of moikeia. So the first one comes from Plutarch Solon, where it just mentions that Solon says that if you found that your daughter has had sex before marriage, you can sell her. And secondly, Aeschines, where he says that, that's right, he tells a story about a man who found out his daughter has had premarital sex, and he walled her up in a small enclosed space with a horse until she died. He decided to use his own punishment there. So I suppose I just want to sort of argue that while the woman's kurios probably had the right to act within the law of moikeia, if he so choose to, he could maybe undertake his own punishment or have no punishment at all, depending on the motivation of the man. And the motivation of the man is dictated by section 3.1, the birth of the nothos. So moikeia sex tends to be is dangerous because it's problematic for bloodlines, inheritance, all these kinds of things. In adultery moikeia, the legitimacy of the husband's children is compromised because suddenly there's this extra third-party element. In premarital moikeia, if a bastard is born, the bloodline is only in trouble if the father and mother remain unmarried. If they then get married, then actually, from a sort of Athenian societal point of view, everything's fine, because the family unit that it is so desired is created. So it seems to me that if, as we have all the time in New Comedy, if a girl has a child before is married, then marries the father of the child, no matter what the circumstances are, then there's no need to apply the law of moikeia, even though your daughter is guilty of moikeia. So it just seems to me that Plangon wouldn't necessarily have expected for her to be punished in this way, which is sort of the argument given. And I think another relevant factor here is the context of the liaison. So if, as we see in passage 2, it happens at the Adonia festival, and I sort of thought, well, what does that say about what's happened? Let's look it up. And so if you look up the Adonia in Burkert, he says it's a cult confined to women with an atmosphere infused with the sweet aromas of incense, but the climax is of loud lamentation for the dead god. Okay, fairly tame. If you look it up in Dortien, she says it is characterized by the abandoned enjoyment of lovers, the drunkenness of courtesans, recherche meals and risque talks. Bedecked and perfumed, the women celebrating the Adonia met their lovers all the more freely because, on a mythical level, but within a ritual framework, the couple formed by Adonis and Aphrodite epitomized the type of relations that exist between a lover and his mistress. Okay, so what do the sources say? If we turn over on page 4, I give a couple of sources here, which to me suggest that the Adonia, to the male audience of the Athenians, was associated with immorality, drunkenness, generally women doing all those things that women do that men hate in classical Athens. So primarily I've given you the passage from Lysistrata, describing how when the men are doing politics, in the assembly, one of their wives is dancing around, screaming out about poor young Adonis, drunk, getting in the way, being disorderly because of the Adonia. Okay. And the second point there is Hydria, which has little erotes in the image of women, slave girls and prostitutes celebrating the Adonia. So I think together these two pieces of evidence suggest that to the Athenian males, upon hearing in the prologue, oh, this happened at the Adonia, they might have thought, oh, well, okay, that's obviously women, but they're all over the place in the Adonia. This might well mean that things that aren't meant to happen. Because of course, young men and women in Athens weren't meant to meet and have sex. That's not allowed. but in these sorts of environments where things are up in the air anyway, maybe it might have done. And I'd just like to finish my discussion of this first argument by wondering whether it makes sense on any level, really, to say that just because Plangon knew that she would have got in trouble for doing this doesn't mean that she mustn't have done it. It seems to me to seems to imply that all women are sort of paragons of virtue and know that they must never do anything wrong because simply it's against the law. But it seems to me that you can sort of draw a vague comparison between sort of crimes of passion in Western terminology. Sometimes bad things happen and you don't premeditate them. It's just a fact of life. And indeed, this might allow us more profitably to interpret a section of the same that I've given to you there. So Moschion, the Moikos, is defending himself, and he says, "My crime isn't all that dreadful, father. Millions have done the same, surely." And commentators don't like this line because to us moderns it seems awful, and it would be for him to saying, "Me raping this girl isn't that bad. Millions have done it." But I wonder whether we can understand this better of him saying, "Oh, I just had covert premarital sex." In his case, it ended up in the birth of a child, which then causes all the problems. But in course, most cases, statistically, it would just be a hidden thing that happened and then was never spoken of again. So that's the first argument. The second argument was that all the references in the text treat Plangon as a victim, not as a consenting participant. And I've given, on page 5, I've given them all the references I can find in the text to any kind of moral judgment or description of what happened being given. So again, I probably won't go through them all, but they can sort of be summarized as Moschion, he knows he's done something wrong. He uses the verb hamartano is used twice, so you've made some kind of mistake. He says he's to blame. He feels ashamed. We saw that earlier. Parmenon, who's his slave, he says to him, he says that he's committed an injustice. He's, don't you fear the girl whom you've injured, en edikerkas. Moschion's terrified of Nikaratos, who's Plangon's father, finding out the truth. And Nikaratos actually calls him a moikos as well, which is one of the primary reasons that we must understand moikos as not just adultery, because it just clearly isn't adultery. So what observations can we draw from these bits of the text? Well, again, it seems to me that Moschion's guilt, admissions of responsibility, etc., are all consistent with the idea that he simply seduced an unmarried woman and got her pregnant. The argument was that we never see Plangon as a victim, and I think that's to be expected no matter what, because Plangon doesn't even have a speaking role in this play. She's barely in it, despite being really, really important. New Comedy isn't that interested, unlike tragedy, we've heard about this previously. New Comedy isn't interested in the women who are sometimes raped, sometimes maybe not raped. It's not interested in what they think or feel. We're only interested in her father, right? Because he's the curios, he's the one in charge. We get the sense that Moschion has violated his consent, which later is then given at the end of the play, right? Like, that's what the marriage ceremony is. He says to him, "I give my daughter to you for the plowing of children," etc. That's what's actually happening. We have a liaison with no consent and then eventually moves to the father's consent at the end. So what about number 4, though? I think number 4 is the strongest case for saying that some sort of rape happened, because the verb is adikeo. A kind of injustice was happened here. And if you look up adikeo in the LSJ, it says that in this kind of context it means to ruin a woman. But I think we might be able to better understand it with a comparison to Menander's Gorgios. So this is a similar play. Again, it's in bits. We don't know many details of the plot. But one of the things we do know is that a young man who's unnamed wants to marry a girl having impregnated her, just like in Samia. But the girl's older brother says no, because he's the curios, because her father isn't in the picture. So the young man, having been told no, you can't marry her, he goes off to try and marry someone else. Then we have this exchange between Felina and Marini. So the latter is the girl's mother, the former is the elderly nurse, probably, we're not entirely sure. But she says, no, damn him and his conduct. Can this man make a marriage when he's wronged this girl? So can the Miaros marry her, edikerkas, having done an injustice, or whatever that means? So I think in this is a useful comparison, because in these points in both plays, what's actually happening is that the man is saying, oh, maybe I won't marry her having got her pregnant and her having a child on her own. It's saying, I'm not going to create the family unit that Athenian society really wanted or needed. So I think instead of seeing it as having sort of ruined a girl, I think it means, as I say, kind of impregnating her and leaving her on her own, putting her in the potential scope for punishment because of moikeia and sort of general shame. That's seen as an injustice, and the man is the one at fault there. So I think to sort of sum up, the evidence as I see it doesn't necessitate the interpretation of rape. I think, to me, there is a case for seeing this being sex being consensual. The evidence suggests that, sure, it was Moschion's fault because he's the one who kind of did something that he wasn't meant to do. He went into the Adonia when he wasn't meant to. It's an all-women festival, that kind of thing. You've also exposed, I hope, flaws that Plangon would never have allowed it. That seems to me to be a rather odd view. And I think, in the end, it doesn't actually matter to the audience whether the act was consensual or not. They don't care at all. That's why Moschion doesn't say it's not relevant. The only thing that matters to the fathers of New Comedy, to everyone in New Comedy, is that a bastard is born and that we have to fix this problem by getting everyone married rightly, and then everything's fine. So I think the conclusion to take from all this is that it's ambiguous whether she was raped, and we can accept that as a satisfactory conclusion, simply because the plays aren't interested in conveying these details. Sometimes it's clear that she was, the girl, her sex was not consensual, as in Epipontes, we saw at the beginning, but otherwise it's not. And so I suppose I just wanted to present this case and to try and maybe present an alternative to what people see as Menander having a rape motif. I don't think that's necessary. And I wonder whether, in a sort of passing remark, we're in our sort of modern age, I think scholars often, we're almost too keen to see rape. I think we've sort of got ourselves in a bit of a hole where we're too keen to see rape, and then we criticize Menander, like some people are really vehement towards Menander in their scholarship to say, you focus the play on the rape victim of Plangon, when actually I don't think that even needs to be the case. So, thank you very much.